Hello everyone, my name is Dan, I like to program. Let's get into this week's problem. So, right over here in example 1, this example should return true because all of the opening braces have matching closing braces and none of the other braces get in between or in each other's way like they do in examples 2 and 3. So in examples 2 and 3, we have a opening parenthesis, an opening square bracket, and then we have a closing parenthesis and then a closing square bracket. This is not okay because you can't have a mismatched closing bracket to an opening bracket. So whatever the last opening bracket is, you need the same closing bracket. If it's a square bracket, you need a square bracket. If it's a curly bracket, you need a curly bracket. And same thing for parentheses. So example 2, no good. So example 3 right here, you have 3 opening parentheses and 1 closing parenthesis. This one's no good because you don't have the same number of closing parentheses. You only have 1 matching closing parenthesis. This is no good because where are the other matching? You can't have one without the other to make a pair. Let's get into the code. Hello everyone, welcome to IntelliJ. I've already gotten started. I have created the public static boolean method isBalanced, where we will pass in a string with our little list of braces. And at the end, we'll determine if it's well-formed by returning true, and if it's not well-formed, we will return false. And then in the public static void main method, we will have 4 test cases. First 2 will return true. Second 2 will return false. And I have them print out right here. And if we run this right now, we'll see that they say for first list, for the second list, for the third list, for the fourth list, returns true, returns true, returns true, returns true. That's because we have the placeholder. It'll change shortly, but this is what it's going to look like for the output. So if we get into it right here, the first thing we want to do is actually define kind of our rules for this. So if we make a block comment right here, the first rule we want to consider is that the number of opening braces cannot exceed that of the closing braces. So many spelling errors. This just means every brace needs a pair. If it doesn't, that's no good. And then for our second rule that we will define, we'll say we'll consider 2 sets of braces. One will be A, and the second one will be B. And with these 2 sets of braces, if the opening brace of A is followed by the opening brace of B, then the closing brace of B must occur before the closing brace of A to be considered a well-formed list. So what this means is, like kind of with the first example, or not the first example, the second example, which was a false example, which we also have right here. So if this is brace A and this is brace B, brace B's closing brace must occur before brace A's closing brace. So that means this is no good because brace A occurs before brace B, the closing braces anyways. So if it was properly formed, we would have brace A opening, brace B opening, then we would have brace B, oh no, what did I do? Then we would have brace B next, and then we would have brace A closing next. But this is a false example, so we're going to put it back to the way it was, and we're going to continue coding. So we're going to start out with a variable that keeps track of the closing braces that we need. So we're going to have closing braces equal to nothing. This is where we'll keep track of the closing braces that we need to encounter next. So for every opening brace, we're going to throw in the closing brace into this string. And then when we encounter a new closing brace, we'll say, hey, is this new closing brace the closing brace I should encounter next? And if it's equal to the last brace in the string, or the last character in the string, then we will say, yes, it is the closing brace I want to encounter, and then it'll move on. And then the next thing we'll do is we'll create the for loop that will go through our string of braces. We're going to go through and we're going to check through every character in the braces string. So for int I is equal to 0, I is less than braces dot length plus I, and then we'll go down. Then we're going to have a character variable that keeps track of the current character. Character is equal to braces dot character at, and this is going to keep track of the current character in the loop, which means it will say we'll put I as the index of the character. So if we're going through the loop for the first time, it'll be the first character. If we're going through the second time, it'll go through the second character, and then it'll keep going and going. So if the first was this one, that would be the character index I for the first loop. This would be I for the second loop. This would be I for the third loop, and so on. Then we'll go down here, and we're going to get into the fun part, where we need to make sure that we don't encounter any out of bounds errors with the way we do this. So we're going to say if the closing braces dot length is equal to 0, and the current character is equal to the parenthesis, or, and then I'll just copy this, put this in a few times. We'll change this one to a square, this one to a curly. So if the closing braces dot length is equal to 0, and the current character in our braces is a closing brace, this means that we don't have a paired opening brace, which means we are going to return false. So an example situation would be return false, not just false. So an example situation would be if we had the string, so this is braces. Let's say braces is equal to the string curly, closing square bracket. So if we went through this list, we would get an opening curly, and then we would say, hey, we got an open curly, we're going to put in a closing curly into this closing braces, and then we would encounter the closing curly, and then later on we're going to say, hey, I encountered a closing curly, is this the closing curly I need? And we'll say yes, it is, and then we'll get rid of it from the list, and then the list will be empty. And so the length of this closing braces list, I say list, I meant string, the length of the string is now 0, but there's this extra closing brace, so we're essentially at this section, and since there is no opening brace, this means it's a invalid or not well-formed list of braces, and therefore we need to return false because it's not well-formed. So this is what this section does. Let me get rid of this. And then this is where we get into the rest of it. We will say else, and then we'll have a whole bunch of if statements here. We'll have one that accounts for the open parenthesis, one that accounts for the opening curly, and one that accounts for the opening square bracket. So current car is equal to the parenthesis. Then we will say closing braces. And this is what I was talking about earlier. Whenever we encounter an opening brace, we will add the closing brace to the closing braces list dot concat, and we will add the closing parenthesis. So if we encounter the closing parenthesis, we're going to add if we encounter the opening parenthesis, we're going to add the closing parenthesis to the closing braces list. And then we're going to do this basically the exact same thing 2 more times. but with the other two. So it's going to be the curly, closing curly, square, square. And so we've accounted for all of the opening braces. Now we got to account for all of the closing braces. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to check to see if the closing brace is the proper closing brace. So we don't really care too much about what it is as long as it's the closing brace we want. So we're going to say else if current character is equal to a closing braces dot character at, and every time we concat this closing braces string, we're adding something onto the end. So that means the last opening brace added its closing brace to the end of the closing braces string, which means we need the character at the end of the closing brace string. So we'll say closing braces dot length -1. Oops. And if it's true that the current character is equal to the closing brace character at the end, then we will just get rid of that last brace at the end. So if we encountered a square bracket during our loop and there was a square bracket in our closing brace, we would say, hey, is this equal? It is equal. Then we're just going to get rid of it and we're going to move on. So closing braces would be equal to closing braces dot substring, and the substring will go from the 0 index to the closing braces dot length -1 index. And we do the closing braces dot length -1 index instead of the closing braces dot length -2 index because substring is non-inclusive of the last index you give it. And then if all else fails, else return false. And so we'll go through one more time. We'll say this is the closing braces string list. This is where we're going to account for all of the matching closing braces to the opening braces. And we're going to go through our braces string, and we're going to grab the character, every character of the braces string at every loop. So we'll go through 0 index character, the 1 index character, the 2 index character, all the way to the end. And then if the closing braces dot length is equal to 0, that means we've encountered a closing brace when this list is empty. That means we've encountered a closing brace without a matching opening brace, and we're going to return false. Else, we're going to move on, and we're going to say if we encounter an opening parenthesis, we're going to add a closing parenthesis to our closing brace list. If we encounter a curly, we're going to do the same and add a curly. And for a square, we'll also do the same and add the square bracket to the closing braces string. And that means if we've gotten through here, that means it's not an opening brace, it is a closing brace. And if the current closing brace we encounter is not equal to the last opening brace we've encountered, which is going to be defined right here. This is going to keep track of the next closing brace we need. If it's not equal to the brace at the end of the string, then we're going to return false. And if it is, we're just going to get rid of that last brace on the string. We're just going to move on and keep going through our braces list until we encounter something else that goes wrong or we discover it's actually a well-formed list. And at the end, there's one more thing we have to do. This accounts for all of the considerations that we had in our our number 2 rule. But if we think about number 1, the number of opening braces cannot exceed that of the closing braces. We haven't considered this yet because we can still have a whole bunch of opening braces with no closing braces when we get to the end right here. And we have to think of a way to consider that. And the way we would do this is we would say closing braces is equal to, length is equal to 0. So this works because if we had a whole bunch of closing braces not closing braces, if we had a whole bunch of opening braces, we would have a whole bunch of extra things in here. So if we had a whole bunch of parentheses, opening parentheses at the end of a string, something like, let's say this was our string right here. We had well-formed, 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 whole bunch of extra parentheses. We would get a whole bunch of extra parentheses in the closing braces list, string, my bad. And by the time we got to the end of the loop, we would have a whole bunch of extras in here, and we would know that this isn't well-formed because of these extras. If it was well-formed, if we had all of the matching closing parentheses, then this would be empty, and that means it would be well-formed by the time we got to the end of the list. And that's why closing braces.length equals 0 would be the return statement if we got through the entire list. And if we go down here and we now test our code, let me get rid of this real quick. If we go down here and test our code, we'll press play, we'll see what happens. We'll see that it is true that this list is formed correctly for the first one, it is true that this list is formed correctly for the second one, and it is false for the last two. And if we look right here, true, true, false, false. Our code worked. And so that is how you check and see if a string of braces is well formed. So if you had a better solution than I did, please leave a comment down below. If you have any questions, also leave a comment down below. If you would like to play with this code yourself, I will leave it in the GitHub in the description. And be sure to subscribe and have a nice day. Goodbye.